Hello there, everybody. It is time for our big lecture on European 18th century social life. Um, we're looking at two things here, really big ideas. One is how people lived their daily lives, and the other is how popular culture and elite culture were growing apart. So those are kind of two reoccurring themes that we're going to come back to as we go through this. Now, this lecture is designed to be broken up about over 3 days, and so this would never be done all at one time, and there's lots of time for discussion on other things. But I'm just getting this recorded here so that we can make sure to have a record of this. So, as we start, we're talking about the beginnings of a belief in progress. There's some very big changes coming up here. We're about to go through the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, which are followed right on those heels by the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. And so what we're looking at here when we look at the 18th century is kind of a glimpse of the last of the old world. And it's also a world that's in transition, that's moving into these big changes that are coming up. But one of the ideas that's been really developing since the Renaissance, since the Age of Exploration brought a lot of things, there's new wealth and new knowledge combining to create a belief in progress, that things can get better. This is a change from the Middle Ages when people didn't really think that at all. Now, if you believe in progress, you believe that things can get better. And so this is going to cause people to inherently challenge new or traditional ideas. And the old ways of doing things. Most historians say that this belief in progress is fundamental to modernity, that this is one of the key features of the modern era. And it really starts as a tiny little acorn here at the beginning of the 18th century and grows up in the Enlightenment. And I think this is a good point here to talk. This entire lecture is really pre-Enlightenment. So it's before the Enlightenment ideas take hold and really start to influence everything. But this belief in progress is going to touch almost every aspect of people's lives, from politics, medicine, production, education, really everything. And I love this quote from Dr. Linda Kirk. She says, "The 18th century saw a growing appetite, even from the slightly educated," and I love the way she words that, "for an understanding and improvement." So to start, we are going to start with the most fundamental social organization, unit of organization, and that is the family. According to the College Board, family and private life reflected new demographic patterns and the effects of the commercial revolution. So I want you to do, before we do anything else here, is take a minute and talk about what does that mean? What does that statement say? So go ahead and pause me here. However, again, according to the College Board, the family remained the primary social and economic institution. This is still the most fundamental unit of the way people organize. And then, like the pictures I show you here, the family is usually nuclear, not extended, meaning it's just mom and dad and kids, which means when you get married, you're moving out of the household. So let's talk about marriage next. Generally speaking, people are getting married a little older at this point in European history. It's 27 or 28 for both males and females in most of the West. Now, generally speaking, women still get married a little younger, and there's still some places like Italy where arranged marriages between very young girls, 14, 15, are still getting married to 30, 35-year-old guys. But that's growing to be the exception. Now, because you're getting married later because you needed years of work to establish yourself. You had to afford a family. You had to afford a household, and so you needed those years built up. And so one way of looking at it, we say prudence, law, and custom postponed marriage. Basically common sense, laws against getting married too young, and just the basic practice. Now, this is going to both create and instill the idea of self-reliance, that you need to be able to do it on your own. And speaking of, we then need to talk about the idea of premarital sex. So up until the 18th century, it's not unusual. People are having sex before they get married. But it's generally between a pretty committed couple, between a couple at least considering marriage. They're together, they're steady, if you will, they're going out. And because of this, there's very few illegitimate children. Because if she done got a case of the preggers, they'd get married. They'd have a shotgun wedding, or I guess a pitchfork wedding, as the case may be. In the second half of the 18th century, after the 1750s, there's an increase in out-of-wedlock children and a decrease in marriage rates. And this is largely due to increased mobility to the cities. There's offer people an escape, so to speak, from their village if they are in a relationship and a pregnancy occurs and they don't want to, and this is either the male or female, to remain in that relationship or even have the child. There's now cities available as an outlet for that. So population growth is still limited by a later marriage. People are getting married later. So even though we have decreased infant mortality at this point compared to the Middle Ages, we're still not seeing a skyrocketing population. Population growth is also limited in some areas by early practice of birth control. This is not, this is not necessarily modern birth control. It's certainly not the pill, but it is practicing birth control. Now, if we're talking about premarital sex and relations, we need to talk about that most common of sexually transmitted diseases, of course, and that is children. People are getting married later, but they're having many kids rapidly, often 6 or more. And so this is a quote from the College Board again. Europe responded to the economic conditions by delaying marriage and childbearing. They're not having kids young, which restrained population growth and ultimately improved the economic conditions of families because they're not having kids when they're too young to be able to afford them or take care of them. Now, even though it is lower than it was in the Middle Ages, infant mortality is still incredibly high. You're guaranteed to lose 1 child in 5 for sure before their first birthday, which is kind of the standard definition of infant mortality. But for the lower classes, it's more like 1 in 3. 1 out of every 3 kids is dying before their first birthday. Just to put that in context, in 2015 in the United States, it's 6 out of every 1,000. So that's a tiny percent compared to the 30% or 20% that we're seeing in early modern Europe. Now, what we see happen is kind of an odd chicken and the egg situation. Because of their likelihood of dying, parents are often emotionally detached from their kids. They don't create this emotional bond. Now, when we think about motherhood and parenthood, we talk about, this bond between the child and the mother and, the skin-to-skin contact and how they're just your little bundle of joy. But that wasn't the case then, which, of course, begets the question, were they likely to die because they were neglected, or were they neglected because they were likely to die? And this is something that demographers, there's really no way of finding out. This isn't really going to change until after we get through the Industrial Revolution. If you studied the Industrial Revolution before and and learned about child labor and sending little kids 6, 7 to work in the mines or factories, that could only happen with emotional detachment that we're talking about here. Now, as far as feeding their children, the lower classes generally breastfed. They nursed their children despite the parents' potential malnutrition, because basically that's free food that the mother is producing. The upper classes actually used wet nurses. These are professional breastfeeders. This would be a lower class woman who just had a child herself recently, and she would breastfeed the rich person's kids as well. It's kind of like here, you take care of this little wretch. And I think that's just a great example of the emotional detachment that I was just talking about. And then we also have foundlings and infanticide, very common among the lower classes. Foundling means giving up a kid for adoption, and infanticide is just as frightening as it sounds. It's the killing of an infant that they couldn't necessarily afford, especially if they're having those kids too early. Now, I like this chart. I think it's really interesting. And I want you to think about what this data tells you. What conclusions can you draw from this data? So take a minute and think about that. Talk about that with somebody. I'll just stay here for a second. Now, both of the College Board's key concepts on this era as far as demographics talk about limited population growth and restrained population growth. But if you look at these numbers, they're skyrocket. They're huge. I mean, we see rapid increases. But what we have to remember is that the population of Europe is still recovering from the plague. And so it should be growing up even more. It should be going up even higher. But the other factors like later marriage, they are the ones that are limiting and restraining it. So now let's talk about the growth of the cities. And this is another important trend that really began during the High Middle Ages. And so people are moving to the cities. The cities offer freedoms. They offer opportunities. And really a lot of times it's the lack of opportunities in the countryside that also act as a push factor. What I want you to do is read these two College Board quotes here and talk about what impact you think this mass migration to the cities is going to have. Now, the cities themselves, the conditions of the cities were appalling. We would by no way feel comfortable in these early modern cities. They were crowded because there was no city planning at all. The cities just kind of grew out of themselves without any organization. Streets and yards were subdivided by private individuals to make more room for housing. There was businesses and residences just on top of each other. Another reoccurring thing that we see happening is there's ever decreasing green space. There's no real regards for keeping any green space, any parks, any natural habitats. They were also filthy. There was no organized waste management. And so we're talking about, garbage and human waste and animal waste. Animals, you had livestock, you had feral dogs, you had rats, and all of the waste of all of these animals in the city. You also had human waste. There was no indoor plumbing at this point. So generally for the masses, you had shared outhouses, which were often little more than holes that just ran right into the streets. You literally had human waste flowing down the streets of most cities and of most streets because that's just where people went. Now, other condition of the city, one of the overwhelming themes we see is that they were noisy. They were just incredibly noisy. There was a cacophony. They were really, really loud. This is the first engraving that we're going to see by a guy named Hogarth. We're going to look at a lot of his. He was producing a lot in this era. And a historian who wrote a book describing this era. It was called Hubbub was the name of the book. I'm going to read a description of this to you, of this engraving. She says, "This image rings with urban disorder and harmony. The violinist, no common fiddler is he, cannot work. A parrot baws beside a billside for the beggar's opera. Beneath the parrot, a female ballad seller with crying babe in arms sings Ladies Fall, a cheerless ballad. She also is a peasant from her hat and has syphilis. You can tell from the bandage holding her jaw. A girl, rattle in hand, watches the young boy as he urinates into a hole. Close by, a piper plays his instrument and a boy demonically beats his drum, while a dog yelps at the sound of a grindstone. The knife sharpener is not the only street worker depicted, for a dustman ringing his bell and a sowgelder astride his horse and blowing his horn also feature. A sowgelder is someone who cuts the men parts off of a cow. The small coal seller bawls off to the side and a paver bashes the pavement back here. Besides the illustrating noises of the moment, Hogarth, the artist of this, also skillfully shows the latent potential for noise. The urinating boy, when spent, will make another sound as the object attached by a rope to his waist is dragged across the ground. Why does he even have that? The flag on the church shows that the bells will ring that day. The sign on the wall says John Long Pewterer, which is a notoriously noisy metal hammering trade. And so this just kind of gives you an idea of the way people viewed the noises of the early 18th century. Now, another aspect of cities is that there was employment opportunities. There was trades that were still dominated by the guilds at this point. These haven't given up their stranglehold on trade in the cities. And there's also still there's developing proto-factories. Not what we would consider factories, but centers where people who live in the cities are starting to go to work. The dominant job for women in the cities was domestic servants. They worked in the households of the upper classes. And then really, why go then is the big question. If they're noisy, dirty, and the jobs are bad, why are people going? Because often the benefits still outweighed the negatives of staying in the countryside. And then the College Board here gives you this. I want to see what you can come up with. Did you actually try to come up with it on your own, or did you just go right to what I was saying here? I want to know. Don't lie. So, cities offered economic opportunities, which attracted migration from rural areas, transforming urban life and creating challenges for the new urbanites and their families. Moving on. So now we're going to talk about the law. And what we're going to see specifically in cities is city government is increasingly regulating morals and safety. But the issue is there's no central police force. There's no government-run police force really anywhere. There's no real law enforcement of any kind. And at no point in the 18th century did either England or France have a true central law enforcement agency. So generally speaking, the two options for trying to restore order were either the military, which were called in to quell major issues, or the militia. Now, my favorite definition of militia, I pieced together a couple definitions. It is an ad hoc paramilitary group of questionable legal status. We in this country have an odd, romanticized version of the militia because we think of the Minutemen and we think of like Paul Revere and fighting the British and stuff like that. But really, they're quite terrifying. Essentially, you're arming a whole bunch of people to try to settle an issue that's probably their neighbors that are rebelling at this point. And so it's usually pretty sketchy and not very restrained. Now, as far as legal proceedings, courts are only in large cities at all, if at all. And we see these courts, they're very different than anything we see that we're familiar with today. There's no rights for accused or witnesses. Torture and bribes are frequently used to get convictions. If you think of what we learned about with the witchcraft trials, these do a pretty good job depicting of just what these trials were like, what most court proceedings were like. Now, usually you only got one of two rulings from a judge. Either they were innocent and they were set free, or they were guilty and sentenced to death. There wasn't a lot of in between. Now, this is a very big idea moving forward. If somebody was convicted to death, torture was frequently used as part of the death penalty. Now, the upper classes were spared torture. They were just given the axe. Their head was just chopped off. It was relatively quick and painless. If the executioner did a good job and didn't miss and had to like pull the axe out and go again. But for the lower classes, torture was a very public and a very big part. It was an event that people would go to. And the idea was it was going to be used as a deterrent. It was a deterrence to crime. And the big idea is that since there was no police force, they wanted to scare people out of their crime, out of other people doing crime. Obviously, killing this person is going to deter them from doing crime in the future. But the idea was to scare the populace from doing any more crime. There also was a religious aspect to it, too. It was a chance to atone for the crime, both the criminal and the community that had failed him. this idea, this England's bloody code, this isn't what it was called at the time, but this is the number of crimes carrying the death penalty. And these are some examples of things that could get you executed if you were convicted of these things. So take a look at this list and see who is this law code designed to protect. I'm still here, so I hope you're thinking about it. These are all designed to protect the upper class. These are designed to protect people with property. Now, what about outside of the cities, outside of the courts? Well, there still was community justice. And these were done because in the absence of official justice, public rituals were used to enforce laws and customs and taboos and the social norms. What kind of things could be subject to community justice? Adultery. If you were stealing from the commons that everybody was supposed to share, taking more than your fair part. Spouse abuse. Of course, the biggest example of community justice was putting someone on trial for, on the local level, witchcraft. Now, the punishments included chivalry. We talked about these way back in the Middle Ages. Ducking chairs. That's what these two are examples of here. Basically dunking someone in the water and then pulling them out. Essentially a version of waterboarding. You're simulating drowning. The idea was public humiliation to try to regulate these norms. And then according to the College Board, local and church authorities continued to enforce communal norms through rituals of public humiliation. Now, ideally, this would be the end of day one. So if you are looking for day 2, you would start here. All right, so now we are starting day 2 of the lecture. Day 2 of the lecture. Schooling, literacy, and language is what we would start out with. So to begin, just kind of a quick review of what education has done as we've started. Beginning in the 1500s, the late Middle Ages, the early Renaissance, rich males begin attending universities. By the 17th century, after we go through the Reformation, elementary schools for commoners are growing, especially in urban areas. Boys and girls between the ages 7 and 12, they learn basic literacy. Now, what we're going to see is that schooling grows a little bit in the 18th century, but there's not a major acceleration. There's no compulsory education in the 18th century. Nobody's being forced to go to schools. In fact, more often than not, the churches, both Protestant and Catholic, are the ones who are running the schools. But the big difference that we do see is in the 18th century, literacy undergoes a rapid and massive increase. We're really seeing kind of the push from the Reformation as more and more people are learning to read, and then Catholics are learning to read. And so it really is a big increase. So even though there's not an increase in formal schooling, more and more people are learning how to read. And the second arrow I have down there is women's literacy rates are also increasing, albeit at a slower and lower rate than men. They were still lagging behind, but it is increasing. Now, as far as reading goes and tying into culture, we see our first example of popular and elite culture really kind of diverging. Oral and print cultures. Where are people getting their culture from? How is culture being transmitted? Elite culture is largely transmitted through books, through schools, and increasingly through newspapers. Although, like it says, that big explosion isn't really going to come until a little bit later. But still, it is a print culture. It is standardized. Popular culture is largely still oral. It's still word of mouth. It's telling stories because a lot of the population is still illiterate. Now, the pop culture, the masses did have some print culture. Pamphlets and almanacs were the most popular. If you remember one of the 8 times you took U.S. history reading about Ben Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac. It was the largest selling almanac of the 18th century, and it was just something simple that really kind of touched on a lot of things of people's lives. The next aspect of this that we're going to talk about, the culture, is language. And this is actually one of my favorite things. I'm so intrigued by the study of language. So we're going to see this is another example of divergence between the two. On the popular level, We have what we call peasant languages, what linguists call peasant languages. These are regional, local dialects with a distinct accent. So they're very local. These can be hyper-local. One village to another might speak a different peasant language. They'd be able to understand each other mostly, but not all the time. These peasant languages are really a product of an earlier lack of mobility, when people didn't move around, when they didn't leave their village. So like I said, sometimes these are undistinguishable from neighboring villages. One of the big examples I like to bring up is if you travel just north of where Libertyville is, about an hour, and somebody wants to get a drink from when they're in school, they go get it from a bubbler and not a drinking fountain. If you say a water fountain to somebody in Milwaukee, they'll look at you like you're crazy. They're thinking like Buckingham Fountain. Another example I like to use, and this is on a more kind of personal level, think about you and your group of friends. The amount of inside jokes that you have and words that you use that don't mean anything except to the people in your group. And then if one person comes in from outside of the group, they have no idea what's going on in conversation. When I was an undergrad, I lived with a group of guys, and for whatever reason, no need to get into it, we started using the word donkey for everything. We started calling each other donkey. Donkey Jones, Donkey Dorn. And then we just started referring to everything as donkey. Donkey, pass me the donkey. If we wanted the remote or something like that, or donkey, you want to go and get a donkey? And it was always the worst when, God forbid, one of us would actually have a date over and you'd be like, donkey me the donkey. And your buddy would get up and, toss you the remote. And that poor girl would just be sitting there like, what in the world is going on? So I guess that's why not many came over twice. But anyway, that's the idea of the peasant language. Now, to contrast with that, the elites are using a standardized, nationalized version of the language. This is the official version of the language. In England, we actually call it the King's English because that was the formal version. Now, this is the version of the language that's transmitted through books, through schools, through newspapers. This is the official language. And so what we see here is with the two different languages developing, it's creating a divide. These two literally can't communicate with each other. And if you want to think, what's the language of the courts? What's the language of the government? We're seeing a group of people that literally can't speak the language of the government, of professionals. And so that's going to create a lot of ramifications here. Now, moving on to living standards. Where did people live? How did they live? So let's first talk about housing. The wealthy, both urban and rural, and if you were wealthy, you probably had one place in both. You had a city home and you had a country home. They lived in large homes with differentiated, specialized rooms that had lots of furniture. So take a minute here and just try to think of what differentiated, specialized rooms are. What are examples of that? I'm not going to tell you. You actually have to think of them yourself. So the poor, according to College Board, households worked as units with men and women engaged in separate but complementary tasks. Again, it's not just the social unit, it's also an economic unit, and their household is father, mother, children all working together. Now, in the countryside, most rural homes were one-room homes, no window and glass. They were drafty. They had dirt floors. And it was usually just, like I said, a single room. That was their living and working space. So those of you who think that you have small houses and are always on top of your parents or siblings, imagine it all being one room. A lot of times, only one bed, too. Now, in urban areas, poor people lived in what we would call apartments today, in small, still single room, but basically multi-dwelling structures. Now, as far as employment goes for people, and this is really important, even though we're getting all kinds of changes, the vast majority of people are still involved in agriculture. They might be involved in the putting out system to supplement their wages, but the vast, vast, vast majority of people are still involved in agriculture in one way or the other. The wealthy, their wealth is still through land, although we might have commerce, proto-industry, that rising middle class. And there are some unpleasant jobs available in the cities, once again, as we talked about, still dominated by the guilds. Now, an interesting thing to look at is clothing. We've looked at this book before, The Chronicle of Western Costume. We've taken a quick look at it. You're going to learn a lot about a society by the way they dress. And generally speaking, similar to we still do today, clothing, people wore what fit their daily activities. The wealthy actually wore clothes to show that they did not do hard work. The big hoop dresses, the frilly cuffs for men, the wigs. You're not working in a machine plant. You're not doing hard labor if you're wearing these clothes. And the wigs especially is one of these signs of wealth and leisure. Those of you who took world history, if you remember foot binding, it's not all that far off from the high heels that we see women and men of the time wearing. Now, the poor generally had two outfits. They had an outfit to wear at work and an outfit to wear at home. And you could tell generally what somebody did by what they wore. If they had a big apron on, they were probably a tan or a big leather apron. And so people were judged by what they wore. And we still do this to this day. If you see a woman walking down the street in high heels and a pencil skirt and a nice blouse and a fancy handbag, you don't look at her and be like, oh, she's probably going to work on a construction site. And at the same token, if you see a guy walking down the street with a little personal cooler and he's wearing jeans and steel-toed boots and a flannel, you don't look at him and think like, he's probably going to court to try a case, right? And so we still do this to this day, even if we don't want to admit it. And I'm not judging based on my normal wardrobe here. I'm just reporting. Now, this is something that really kind of gets people's skin crawling a little bit as far as personal hygiene goes. Bathing. Full immersion bathing was rare. People didn't take baths or showers for the simple reason that water was hard to come by, and even if you had it, it was dirty. It was filthy. And so bathing was usually a dry process with a very coarse brush to kind of like exfoliate the skin. And then the wealthy would use perfume to kind of cover them. From everything I've read, basically the 18th century city smelled a lot like the guy's locker room down in the main hallway after they all run the mile. Just like body odor, sweat covered up with Axe body spray, and just awful. Now again, bathrooms, we talked about these a little bit at the beginning. There was no indoor plumbing. And so people used outhouses in the yard or alley that would just flow down to the river. The wealthy might have bedpans in their house, and so they'd just go in their house, and then literally the servants would just fling it out the windows onto the street. So, gross. Now, as far as people's lifestyle goes, we need to also talk we also need to talk about their diet. Now, for the masses, bread was their staple. That was the main part of their diet. That was what most of their caloric intake came from. And they would eat veggies and then meat maybe once a week. That's really about it. Now, as we see the development and acceptance of the potato, that is going to improve the diet of the lower classes, both rural and urban. But they still have a very deficient diet, especially in protein and other vitamins you get from meat. Now, the elites, for their part, ate a lot of very rich foods, meats and sweets and cheeses, very heavy foods. And they ate very few vegetables. Vegetables were seen as the food of poor people. That's what the poor eat. I don't recommend trying this at home tonight. Like, Mother, I don't want to eat my broccoli. That's what the poor eat. Anyway, so what we also see as far as consuming beverages, beer and wine are consumed by everybody at really all meals. Because it's safer than the water. It's processed, and so it's not filthy. It doesn't have diseases. And also, all classes are drinking coffee and tea. The boiled water is going to kill most of the diseases off, and it also hides the flavor. The part that I think is really fascinating about this is coffee and tea are exotic food items. I mean, you're talking about coffee from either the Middle East or from Latin America, tea from India and China. And this is just connecting the age of exploration. These become such common items that even the poorest of the poor are consuming them. Now, neither class is very healthy because they both have, mass deficiencies in their diet. And if anything, the emerging middle class might be the healthiest because they can afford meat more frequently, but they're not so wealthy that they can afford not to eat vegetables. And so we see that emerging middle class maybe being the most healthy of all of them. Now, speaking of health, we've got to talk about this idea of what people had. And this is one of the things that's hardest for us to wrap our heads around, one of the biggest differences between our Western modern America and back then. The College Board says by the 18th century, plague had disappeared as a major epidemic disease, which is true. It never really came back again. However, it was replaced by everything from smallpox, typhus, bloody flux, which is what they call dysentery, gout, which is too much, basically it's an inflammation of the joints, measles, rickets, scurvy, which is a deficiency of vitamin C, rickets is a deficiency of vitamin D. So all of these things that come from having a nutrient deficient diet. And both classes were affected. Nobody was really clear of this because of the dirty water, because of the poor diet, because of the human filth around. But really, it was because of a lack of understanding of disease. People didn't know what spread disease, so they didn't really know how to stop it from being spread. Interestingly, what we see also emerge is some diseases associated with certain classes or moral behaviors. Gout was a rich, old, fat man's disease. And so if a character in a book had gout, the readers could immediately make assumptions about what he was. Syphilis was a sexually transmitted disease, and people would automatically make judgment about the person's character if somebody had syphilis. And so those are different things that are associated with disease. Now, after Jenner, which we will get to, inoculation reduced smallpox mortality. And so fewer people died from smallpox after Jenner did his thing. And then this is just kind of one of the most interesting parts, is almost everybody had tooth decay. There was no oral hygiene really to speak of. That didn't emerge until much, much, much later. And so people's teeth just started rotting out of their heads, usually by the time they were in their 30s. And even the wealthiest had dentures, especially with their, sweet diet. And of course, the most famous 18th century denture wearer was George Washington, if you've read about his wooden dentures and what have you. So while we're talking about health, let's talk about medical practitioners. And so faith healers and apothecaries are still active. They're still from the Middle Ages, still, from even pre-modern era, they're still there. But we're getting the development of some other medical professionals. We have physicians who would make house calls for the rich. But their primary cures, such as they were still bloodletting, tapping a vein and getting out the bad blood, or purging, making somebody throw up so that they would get rid of the bad. Now, surgeons are actually improving in this era, largely because of all their practice and findings on the battlefield. So many wars in the 18th century were allowing surgeons to develop new techniques. We actually see this happening, sadly, again today with all the improvised explosive devices in America's various wars and soldiers getting limbs blown off, but surviving. But there's enough blood clotting agents to allow these soldiers to survive. And so now we're actually seeing a golden age of prosthetics because these soldiers are surviving. So, like the 18th century, it's a time where warfare actually makes medical advances, albeit at a very heavy cost. Midwives are still delivering the majority of babies. These are professional baby birthers. They're usually older women who know the ins and outs of birth, and they are professionals. Now, what we also sadly see develop is as the medical profession becomes more professional and organized, it's of course being dominated by men who push these midwives out of delivering babies. And we actually see infant mortality and mother mortality increased because these women who were professionals who knew it, who did it themselves, are being replaced by men who have little to no gynecological knowledge whatsoever. Now, hospitals, this is where the masses generally go. Hospitals are really the place where only the poorest go, and you generally go there to die. It's when your family can't take care of you anymore. Again, there's no knowledge of what is spreading diseases, really, and so sick people are all just in the same big room. There's no hygiene, there's no cleaning of instruments or anything like that. There's no quarantining, and so they're pretty awful places. But we do begin to see medical experiments like Jenner that we talked about with smallpox. And people are taking the next steps in disease prevention, and we're going to see some big steps come as we move forward. The next idea to talk about is religion. And so this is still a dominating force in European history. This is another Hogarth, by the way, kind of mocking a preacher and people falling asleep in his sermon or not paying attention. But then, of course, there's the heathen Turk who wants to listen in and find the true religion. So anyway, the majority of people are still committed to their Christian religion, and their focal point is the parish church. Whether they're in a small town or a city, that is still the center of their world. We actually see Protestantism go through a revival in the 18th century. It's kind of a reforming of the Protestants. Basically, a lot of Protestants thought they had gotten away from their roots, from their Lutheran roots. And so John Wesley's Methodism, if you've ever heard of any Wesleyan school, or the Methodists, this comes out in this time period. Now, we also got to talk about Catholic piety. This is really a very big idea. And this is another one of these areas where we're seeing a divergence between the popular and the elite culture. The elites adhere to a strict Catholic ideology. Whatever the Pope says, whatever Catholic doctrine says, that's what they adhere to. But popular culture often combines Roman Catholicism and traditional beliefs, more spiritual beliefs in magic and witchcraft. Some examples that I like to bring up for this is, if you've ever knocked on wood, if you ever said like, oh, we're totally going to win, and then like knock on wood, why do you do that? It actually goes back to way ancient times when people wanted to knock on a tree. If they said something boastful, they'd knock on a tree to scare the wood nymphs back into the tree, because those would be the little buggers who would come out and smite them for their hubris. The other example, if you've ever looked at a clock and it said 11:11, and you're like, oh, make a wish. Who exactly are you wishing to? Are you praying to God? Are you praying to the God of the clocks, all ones, all powerful? These are just like common folk beliefs. They're holding your breath as you drive past a cemetery. Now, obviously, those are some more modern examples. But what we see is with the elites adhering to strict beliefs and the masses bringing in other ideas, it both demonstrates and makes worse the growing divide between them. And so these people don't even practice their religion, which should be a great unifying feature together. So then we have, again, from the College Board here, rituals reflecting the persistence of folk ideas reinforced and sometimes challenged communal ties and norms. I want you to put that into your own words before we move on. So I know it gets cut off there at the bottom. Challenge communal ties and norms. So put that in your own words. Boom! Another idea tying into religion is we're seeing a declining belief in witchcraft and magic among the elites in the upper class. They aren't buying that as much. The lowers, as I was just talking about, still for the most part believe. They don't believe in a world ruled by demons and divine forces quite as much anymore. It's not as prevalent as it was earlier because partially there's not as much religious fervor going around like there was in the Reformation. So they are still present. They're just not as dominant. So now the very last part of our lecture here, leisure and recreation. What do people do for fun? Fairs and carnivals were really the focal point of culture. It was the highlight of the year, especially for the masses. This was when they got to let it all out. Think of Libertyville days if you want a modern comparison. The College Board says leisure activities continue to be organized according to the church calendar and the, what cycle is going to dominate it? Agricultural cycle, and remained communal in nature. Communal especially means really all aspects of society took part in this. There were shows at these fairs and carnivals, puppets, jugglers, acrobats. There was a lot of blood sports, bear baiting, where they'd tie a bear to a stake and then have, like on a rope on a stake, and then have dogs fight it, and who was going to win, the dogs or the bear. There was dog fights and cockfighting. So these were what we call blood sports. These were very common in the time and very popular. And of course, all of these blood sports relate to gambling, because you don't do these just to watch, you're betting on them. These fairs and carnivals also gave people an opportunity to buy exotic items that are usually not available in their town. Metalworks, these itinerant peddlers would come in and bring things, different cloths perhaps. Going back to the Libertyville days, I always think of those big treats with the powdered sugar, the like waffle things, whatever you call them. Like those are exotic items for sure. There were also rowdy spectacles. There was a lot of drinking. There was a lot of violence. This was a chance for people to just kind of let go of inhibitions, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And then so I really like this College Board statement here. Popular culture, leisure activities and rituals reflecting the persistence of folk ideas, reinforced and sometimes challenged communal ties and norms. So this is, again, we just talked about this one a moment ago. Talk about it again in relation to fairs and carnivals. This is a very famous painting. It's been used on the College Board exams multiple times. Peter Bruegel, the younger, the fight between Carnival and Lent. This is a carnival scene, which always, like Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, takes place right on the precipice of Lent, which is a Christian time of abstinence. So you see both going on, and there's all kinds of amazing things going on here. Music playing, drinking, celebration. These guys are jousting. They're making a cleric joust here. He clearly is not wanting to participate. Just kind of all kinds of fun stuff. And so the part I really like to think about is that these carnivals tested social boundaries with limited outbursts of deviance. The point was to turn the social order upside down. Women bossed around men, wives bossed around their husbands, the poor could boss around the rich and stand up to them. The apprentice could tell his master what to do and order him around for a day. This really promoted youth and kind of frivolity. It also, very importantly, and this is a really important part here, it provided a release of tension, of pent-up frustration, of aggression. We read the cat massacre, and we read about just how angry those guys were. They just get angrier and angrier and angrier, and then the big release happens, and it's almost like they can get through it for another year. They can get through being berated by their master and living in these horrible conditions because they have this memory to get them through a while and then look forward to it. The biggest carnival is Carnival, it's actually called. It's still celebrated. We in the States celebrate it as Mardi Gras down in New Orleans. Fat Tuesday is the big last explosion. It's like this big indulgence period before Lent, which again is a period of abstinence from sex, from meat, from alcohol on the Christian calendar. Now, the kicker is that the elites increasingly see these carnivals as vulgar, and they don't participate in them. So now it's just the masses. So they're still fun, but they no longer serve the same purpose. There's no longer necessarily the release because both groups aren't participating in it. And if you want to see a great example, we'll watch it here in class. It's actually Topsy-Turvy from the Disney movie, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. So hopefully you got a lot out of this lecture. I just realized I forgot to tell you when to stop day 2, but I'll be sure to tell you that in class. So again, remember our goals for this was to figure out how people live their daily lives and to see how popular and elite culture were growing apart. So make sure you look back and reflect on those goals to see how this lecture fits in there. And thank you for listening. Have a great afternoon or evening or morning, whenever you're watching this. We'll see ya.